Welcome to the Marc Steiner Show right here on the Real News Network. It's great to have you all with us once again. Today we have two very different but fascinating segments to bring to you. We're going to open by looking at the NCAA and college sports and how they're putting profits over people in the midst of this COVID epidemic. Our guest, our Nation Magazine sports editor and host of the Edge of Sports podcast, David Zirin, and Alejandro Danois, journalist and author of the book, The Boys of Dunbar, and producer for the ESPN Films 30 for 30. Then we bring you a conversation with two Green Party leaders, Margaret Flowers and Andy Ellis. We're going to hear their take on what lies ahead under Biden-Harris. All that's coming up. But now it's time for sports from the people's perspective. Welcome to the Marc Steiner Show right here on the Real News Network. Good to have you all with us today. You know, we all got to figure out what is going on with college sports. What's happening with football and COVID? I mean, many colleges are playing football, basketball happening despite this raging pandemic. But why? I mean, more than 18, 20 football games have been canceled so far or postponed just in the month of November because of COVID-19. More than 100 games have been called off this season because players have tested positive. Yet the games continue. Now, here to talk about that and why that is happening and what this formation's about and why this kind of capitalist surge is happening to force for profits, not caring about the players. We have two men who really know what they're talking about when it comes to the politics of sports in our nation. We are going to look at all of that and see what goes on with our friend Dave Zirin, sports editor for The Nation, and who is the host of Edge of Sports, and Alejandro Danois, journalist and author of Boys of Dunbar and producer for ESPN Films 30 for 30, Baltimore Boys. Gentlemen, good to have you both with us.
Great to be here. Thanks, Mark.
Always great to be with you guys.
So, I mean, let me just start here. To me, almost emblematic of what has been happening in college sports since COVID is this back and forth that happened around Clemson and Florida State. You know, Clemson coach, what's his name? Dabo Swinney, right? So he just went after the Florida Seminoles, accusing them of ducking his team, being afraid to play. And I think the quote is, I'm going to just quote to you all. He said, "This game was not canceled because of COVID," he says. "COVID was just an excuse to cancel the game. I have no doubt their players wanted to play and would have played, and the same with the coaches. To me, Florida State has forfeited the game." And then Nikki Haley, the former governor, jumps in to say, "Florida State, whether you lose today or a few days from now, won't matter. Get over this irritation in it already. Stop stalling." So, Dave, I'll start with you. I mean, give us some context here. What the hell is going on?
Well, what's going on, first of all, is the pandemic just becoming yet another trope in the culture war instead of a health issue, which we're all looking at objectively. I mean, that's not just about college sports. College sports is just a microcosm to this process. I mean, the responses by former Governor Haley and by Coach Sweeney are beyond irresponsible and disgusting. I mean, turning the pandemic into a macho kind of ritual instead of something that should be looked at objectively, and we should be looking at the health and well-being of the students, or so-called athlete students. Look, here's the reality of it. I think that COVID has ripped the veil off of any pretense of college sports as some kind of amateur pursuit. When you have a situation in many states where the students are being told to stay home, yet these unpaid college athletes in the revenue-producing sports, which is centered around black athletes and black bodies, when they are called essential workers, and yet the students themselves are told to stay home, it just reveals what this is about. It's about a for-profit enterprise. It's about it being a tent pole to hold up state and private universities, and it's not about the well-being of anybody other than those at the top.
Let's parse that all out. Ali, let me jump in here. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, you know, Dave makes an excellent point in the financial ramifications and the relationship between big money college athletics and how that intersects with the university, right? And the amateurism argument that everyone makes, I think now we're starting to peel that back and really understand that the university exists as an ancillary operation to the football and basketball programs, as opposed to athletics actually kind of being a lesser part of the university. what we're seeing is when you look at the numbers, the Ivy League institutions who are not dependent on revenue from college football and college basketball basically did the wise thing and said, we're not going to have sports this year, especially in the fall. They toyed with playing fall sports in the spring and recently made a decision that it's just not healthy, it's not worth it, it's the wrong thing to do. But these other universities have not been putting away money in a rainy day fund or a COVID fund, and they were ill prepared for this scenario. And what you see is just a basic bottom line business decision because those universities are so dependent on that television revenue and the hits that they're taking in terms of not having a live gate, in terms of the local economies, the bars, the restaurants, all of the economic ecosystem that revolves around college sports. People are just throwing these athletes out there into just a terrible situation.
It makes me the things that both of you just said here. It makes me think of a couple of things, and the interplay of history and where we are now. You talk about Ivy League. Well, Ivy League schools have huge endowments, and part of those endowments were built on enslavement in the 18th century, and they're very wealthy, and they are playgrounds and academic centers for the wealthy, even though the student population is broader now, but it's still the reality there. And it makes me think of a William Roden, who coined that term around football and racial disparity as $40 million slaves, which was the title of his book. And I think about that in terms of what we're facing here. This is like what you were saying, Dave. This is like it's this kind of perfect storm that has come together. The contradictions of capitalism, the need for universities to use the labor mostly of young black men to raise money for schools so they can survive, forcing them to play despite COVID, and playing these macho games with it. I mean, so if how do you make that plain about the contradictions coming to bear here?
Well, I think we have to be very direct, and I've said this so often, I have practically have repetitive stress disorder in my jaw. But it's as simple as this. College athletics in the revenue producing sports, when you take away all of the fancy lights and the cameras, all it is, it's a multi-billion dollar mechanism to steal black wealth. And I think it needs to be said very directly in that regard. These are multi-billion dollar enterprises. Coaches make millions of dollars. And yet the people whose bodies are on the front line, whose blood, sweat, and tears go into it, it's centered around black athletes who come from disproportionately poor backgrounds. And so the money that's produced, the literally billions of dollars that's produced, does not go into black communities, and it doesn't go into black families. It stays at the top of that society. These athletes have no unions. These athletes have no way to collectively express their voices. Anytime there's some sort of roundtable that the NCAA does about how they can be less obscene, athletes notoriously are always left out of that conversation, are never at the table. And that's what we need to focus on, I think. Another thing I say to folks to make it like super plain is I go to that school you mentioned earlier, Clemson. And I say, look at Clemson in 1981. They won a national championship that year. Their coach, Danny Ford, made 50 grand for coaching them to a championship. Dabo Swinney, with bonuses and whatnot, makes in excess of $10 million.
What? Whoa. Stop saying. He makes what?
About $10 million a year. Now, how does a job, and I say this as the husband of a teacher, how does a job that was a 50 grand a year job in 1981 become a $10 million a year job in 2020? I mean, the answer to that is quite simply television revenue and the wealth that's poured into the game. And then the question becomes, why isn't that wealth going to the athletes themselves? So they have to set up this elaborate mechanism that costs millions of dollars, the mechanism in and of itself, to keep black athletes in a position of disempowerment relative to the money that's produced.
I mean, Ali, that glaring contradiction. I mean, I think most people don't understand or get the glaring contradiction. It's not out there for people to grab a hold of.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge contradiction, and it just sheds a light on, again, the student athletes, right, and the rights that they do not have because they are the producers of this phenomenal engine of income. You look at the University of Louisville, and you can see a prime example in terms of what sports and the big money that goes into sports, how that affects the university. Their Hall of Fame basketball coach previously, Denny Crum, won 2 national championships there. He was previously an assistant coach at UCLA under John Wooden, perhaps considered the greatest college basketball coach of all time. He goes to Louisville. He builds a national championship program, but this is before the television money got really, really big. And so when Tom Jurek was hired as the athletic director there, Denny Crum was going through some middling seasons. The school had basically lost its cachet atop the world of college basketball. And Louisville was simply a commuter school with ugly industrial architecture. And what Tom Jurek did in terms of building that football program, telling ESPN, we'll play anybody, anywhere, anytime. They took that Tuesday night ESPN slot. He fired Denny Crum. He hired Rick Pitino. Now, if you look at Rick Pitino's history of the things that he experienced at Louisville, right? He had a huge scandal with an intimate relationship with a woman he just met at a restaurant. He had a Strippergate scandal where strippers were hired to provide entertainment for existing players and recruits in the dormitory. Now, mind you, this is not a normal dormitory. These guys have extra king-size beds. They have huge showers and hot tubs, and just the amenities are ridiculous. The football program hired as a coach Bobby Petrino, who was fired at Arkansas because he had an affair and had a motorcycle accident with his lover on the back of the motorcycle. But all of that stuff kind of gets pushed to the side because Bobby Petrino has an exciting offense and puts butts in the seats, and Rick Pitino wins national championships. That Yum Center that basketball team plays in Louisville is probably better than 80% of NBA arenas today. It seats 23,000 people. The stands are always full. There's a remarkable energy, and they have used that money to build Louisville up to become no longer this commuter school of ugly industrial architecture. But now if you go to that campus and you see the facilities and you see the dormitories, college sports built what Louisville is today. And you juxtapose that with the athletes, and Dave touched on the fact that, you know, these athletes are being thrown out there to the wolves. If these guys take $200 to feed their family because mom lost her job, they become ineligible, right? And so we really have to now take a further look, and Dave and I have talked about this for years in terms of college athletes and their rights and the money that gets floated around and this sham of amateurism. So COVID has just really further exposed that. And now the NCAA is finally talking about allowing players to profit off of their own image and likeness. But that money they're going to have to find on their own, and it's not coming out of the income that the university generates. They're not sharing it.
Exactly. I mean, I just real quick about the name, image, and likeness point, which is very important. That does represent a degree of progress. Of course, it happened because the California state legislature basically had a gun to the NCAA's head and said, either you do this or we're going to impose this legally with our terms on the players in the state of California. So the NCAA was forced to relent on that. But even that, think about what they're asking these 18, 19-year-old students to be. They're asking themselves to not just be athletes, not just be students, but now also be brand managers for themselves, to try to basically put themselves out there as if it's just another part of the gig economy, and try to get local businesses to subsidize them. And that, of course, privileges, quarterbacks. It privileges the known players. It's not something that most players are even going to be able to take part in. So the idea that the basic idea, the fundamental principle that these should be university employees precisely because they produce revenue for the university, that I worry with the name, image, and likeness discussion gets lost.
Mm-hmm. So let let me ask you, where we go with this as a society. I mean, what kind of issues can be raised? What kind of issues can people who are part of a progressive movement, let's say inside the Democratic Party in Congress or outside of that, can do? You talked about California. So in terms of on a national level here, I mean, it seems that this is really exposing all the contradictions of what college athletics is about. It's about, when people like Nick Saban, the Alabama coach, tells his players they'd be safer on the field than at home, even though he has COVID himself and has had it twice. So this seems to be an opportune moment for somebody to grab the time and say we have to investigate this. This has to change. This is not what colleges were about. This is not where people go to school. When we talk about players being able to go out and make money of their own, as you just said, Dave, it's that very few players can take advantage of that. There's a very complex world. Again, that's just kind of throwing a capitalist bone that will not resolve the issue. So what really has to happen for Congress, somebody else, to force America to wake up to what's being done to our kids in college who are playing sports and how to change that, especially in this time of COVID?
Oh, just to say, first of all, it's very ironic because in this case, you see a lot of progressively minded folks who are asking for the free market for these college athletes. And then you see a lot of the people in the right wing who want to keep these athletes in a state of indentured servitude. And I think in some respects, that gives a lot of the game away in terms of these so-called free marketeers. I mean, they're free marketeers for themselves and their own interests, but not for these young, predominantly black athletes. I think that there is absolutely legislation that can be pushed. The problem is that the NCAA, they literally, I used to have the exact number, but they spend an insane amount of money, millions upon millions of dollars, to have law firms on constant retainer for the purposes of attacking anybody who dares step up and does anything. So I'm wary about legislation as a solution. I think the solution lies more in collective action. In the athletes themselves taking on workplace actions as a way to enforce their will upon what's happening in the program. We've seen some examples of this. Grambling State did it successfully a few years ago. Missouri did it very successfully in getting the president of the school fired because of concerns about racism and racial violence on campus, and he wasn't doing anything about it. But there has to be something where they take similar actions for the purposes of basic workers' rights.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about Dabo Swinney and his exorbitant $10 million salary, and he's one of the loudest voices decrying the idea that players deserve to get compensated. People don't understand that a scholarship is not a 4-year contract with players. It is renewable by each year. So if a coach brings a player to campus and the player kind of doesn't live up to the potential that the coach thought this kid had, he can run him off campus. These guys have life-threatening injuries. They're 30 and 40 years old, have to have knees replaced, hips replaced, but they don't have money to afford the medical care that is a byproduct of what happened when they were on the football field sustaining these terrible injuries, right? So, colleges really need to understand that, hey, maybe this scholarship needs to be a lifetime, not just for a bachelor's degree, but if you want to come back and get a master's, if you want to get a PhD, you need to look at the medical benefits that these guys do not have once they leave campus and how they're basically just cut off once their eligibility is expired. So, Dave touches on the point, and we saw it in the NBA bubble when the Milwaukee Bucks said, we are not going to play today. And the rest of the players decided that they were not going to play the games. And that spurred an immediate reaction on behalf of the league. College athletes need to understand the collective power that they hold. And I think coaches like Dabo Swinney need to look at their labor force and have some empathy and understanding. Whereas, you can make $10 million a year, but this guy, you can run off campus, or if he's injured, there's just so many different elements to it. But I really think if the players came together in college football and college basketball, in the power conferences, and just decided, you know what, we're just not going to play any games this weekend. You'll see how fast the discussion escalates.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Overnight.
if you take this in total here, I mean, there are obviously over 30 teams that have stopped training, practicing, and doing games, and many of those are the Ivy League schools that we talked about earlier. But the NCAA is still talking about continuing the March Madness when it comes to basketball. You're seeing even in professional football, where so many like of the local team in my city here in Baltimore, the Ravens, the major players on that team are COVID positive. And so and the NFL is trying to force games to be played anyway, despite that. So it just seems to me that maybe it's time for us. I mean, sports, has America by the short hairs. I mean, we love watching games. And so it's part of the pastime, which is one of the things that people are arguing we should force players to play to entertain us in our living rooms as we're stuck here. But this also seems to me to be a time when we should be really raising the bar of the discussion and forcing America to look at what this means for the whole country. How many ways these players are the canaries in the coal mine about what we are as a society and what's happening to us during COVID.
And one thing that we've learned over the past 4 years, or at least I can speak personally and say that I've learned, America is not a very bright country in terms of the collective. Like, we get spoiled by having these really intelligent conversations with Dave and with you, Mark, but people are dumb, okay? And the fact that they can turn on the TV and they can watch Clemson play against Notre Dame and watch thousands of idiotic Notre Dame college students rush the field in the midst of a pandemic and celebrate the fact that regardless of 23 Baltimore Ravens players testing positive, they're going to get this game on by hook or by crook. And it gives people who aren't that bright this illusion that everything is fine, right? So they want to celebrate around their institutions. They want to celebrate around their teams. So even though the stadiums aren't full, if you go to certain states down south, you still got 15,000 people together in a stadium. You got people tailgating. You got people at bars. They're telling people don't travel, don't see your family on Thanksgiving. But I bet you if you go down to South Carolina for the next big Clemson game, you're going to find people rallying around that team, that program, this college football that gives these people a sense of worth. And it really masks what's really going on in terms of the dangers of this pandemic.
Yeah. Yeah, Louisa Thomas just wrote about this in depth in the New Yorker about where she poses the very provocative question: has college sports actually abetted the pandemic? Like, is it actually responsible for some of the spread of the pandemic? And the conclusions she comes to are really, really depressing. And it speaks to Ali's point about our collective intelligence, because one of the things that we've done is turn this pandemic, I said this earlier, into another culture war trope. And there are few things dumber than turning a disease into a red state, blue state issue. I can't imagine anything more dunderheaded than that. But when you go to what college football is, and this again goes to something Ali said, is that we have to realize that college sports, unlike other pro sports, is so much more of a collective community exercise. I mean, it's not just about what happens in the stadium. It's what happens at the frat house. It's what happens at the local bar. It's what happens in all sorts of settings where people gather collectively to watch. And that has aided and abetted the spread of this pandemic in some very vulnerable places, because especially in the Southeastern Conference, I mean, you're talking about, I mean, we forget this sometimes, like, because these college teams like Alabama and whatnot are so like lauded in glory and glitz and glamour, that these are some of the poorest states in the United States. They have some of the worst health infrastructure in the United States. They have some of the worst scholastic levels in the United States too, and that's made them, I think, easy prey for this pandemic. And college sports, college football in particular, has aided and abetted and actually helped facilitate the pandemic in a lot of these communities.
So, I mean, let's kind of round this out with what you two have just touched on, which is, how we relate this kind of issue of what's facing in college sports and the players to what's going on in the larger society in our political world. And you all touched on it. I mean, you can call part of the world, like dummies and stuff, but it's also, seems to me, that it really does speak to the political divide in this country. It does speak to what pushes the interests of large institutions, which is money, and how that really, to me, is emblematic of a larger struggle we're facing around COVID and the society in general. So, I mean, I'd like to conclude with your thoughts around that, and to see where this might take us. I'll start with Ali, and we'll conclude with Dave.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating time from a cultural perspective, right? From an educational perspective, just to study what's happening in sports as it relates to politics, as it relates to our health crisis. There's just so many layers to peel back, and I'm really interested to see how we walk out of this. But the basic bottom line premise when we're talking about college sports, major college sports in a pandemic, it's always about it's about the money, right? So you can turn on March Madness and you can listen and you can watch the highlights and you can have this very antiquated romantic idea about buzzer beaters and the Final Four and one shining moment, right? But they are going to do whatever they need to do to fulfill that $1 billion contractual obligation because they need the money. And if a few students, if a few athletes happen to get COVID, they'll just figure out how to keep it going. They'll postpone, they may cancel. But like you touched on earlier, Mark, they're already talking about putting that bubble together in Indianapolis. And March Madness is going to happen, whether it should or not.
Amazing. Yeah, it's bleak. Of that, there's no doubt. I keep thinking of what sports writer Jane McManus said about sports are the reward for having a functioning society, and that's how we should understand sports. Our society is not functioning right now. It's not a functioning society now, and this idea that there's somehow this thirst for sports that people have is incredibly over exaggerated. 47%, according to a Marist poll, of sports watchers are watching less sports since the pandemic started. That's almost half the sports audience. And the number one reason they found for why people are watching less sports, and this cuts across all sports. So people who are like, oh, they're turning off the NBA because they say Black Lives Matter, that's BS. People are turning off golf, people are turning off NASCAR, and the number one reason is precisely because of the pandemic. I mean, people are trying to, keep their lives together. And in that context, watching sports doesn't exactly rush to the top of the list of things to do. But what it's all about is what Ali said. It's about fulfilling these multi-billion-dollar television contracts. And for a lot of these leagues, this is a true existential threat. This is about their survival if they can't fulfill this. And it's about the survival of the jobs of the six-figure salaried vice presidents at the NCAA. So there is so much financial incentive. It's not that these people are evil. They're fighting for their financial survival in the context of a pandemic, and they're willing to put young, unpaid people at the tip of the spear in order for them to do it, which is, I think is morally unconscionable. But it speaks to what their class position is relative to these students, and it speaks to which of the amount of money that's clearly at stake. So this is where we're at. These players are now essential workers, and the games are not going to be canceled. So all that's left is for the players to take some kind of collective action, so at least they can wring out a measure of justice on questions of wages and on questions of health in the context of a brutal situation.
Very well put. I really want to thank both of you for being here. Dave Zirin and Ali Danois. Oh, it's good to have you both here. Takes me back to our time together on the radio when you used to join me on the radio show. It's good to have you and see you both as opposed to radio. It's good to have you here. And if you haven't seen it yet, let me recommend that you go to thenation.com and check out Dave's latest piece on Maradona, his two articles, which are amazing pieces about the great soccer player who just passed away. So I want to thank you both so much for joining us here on the Marc Steiner Show. It's been great to have you both with us.
Always an honor and a privilege, Mark, Dave. Always appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Right back at you both.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And coming up in the next segment of the Marc Steiner Show, we talk with leaders of the Green Party, Margaret Flowers and Andy Ellis, about what to expect in this new Biden-Harris administration. And from their perspective, warning progressives and folks on the left not to be so complacent. Enjoy. Let us know what you think, too. Welcome to the Marc Steiner Show here on the Real News Network. Good to have you all with us. And you know, President-elect Joe Biden recently announced his cabinet appointments in a number of ways, but for economic positions. He made Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen the new Treasury Secretary, and Adewale Adeomo, the former Obama economic advisor, to the Deputy Secretary position. Now, part of his focus seems to be on raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, which now many people are saying is an outdated figure. He says he supports the unions, revitalizing the middle class, protecting and building on the Affordable Care Act, reducing the loan debt that people have to carry in this country, and building infrastructure and investing in rural America. Sounds good, but what does that really mean? And we'll have a series of conversations coming around over the next few weeks as we lead up to this inauguration to see just what's going to happen under Biden-Harris. And today we have two people who have been campaigning for social, racial, and economic justice for a long time. Margaret Flowers, she's director of Popular Resistance and has been a candidate herself, and Andy Ellis, former co-chair of the Baltimore City and Maryland Green Party. And good to have you with us.
Thank you, Mark.
It's great to be with you.
So I'd really like to explore here, from your perspective, what you think of what you've heard so far about Biden's plans. How will they work? Do they go far enough? Do they go too far? That I doubt will be your position. I mean, so let's talk just for a minute, a bit about where you think we are with all of this. I mean, clearly, Biden is a centrist, and nobody's ever argued that. That's who he is. So what do you think about what's unfolding, Margaret?
I would actually say that Biden is to the right of the center. You know, Obama at least kind of nodded to the progressives and used some, nice language. But Biden has come out, swinging against the working class. He says, if you put National Improved Medicare for All on my desk, I won't sign it. He says, no, I don't support a Green New Deal. And, if we look at his history and then also look at what he's talking about, I'm not seeing a substantial difference from the basic kind of neoliberal capitalist policies that we've seen coming from all of these previous administrations. So I think that, and looking at who he's putting into his cabinet positions, I think that people need to recognize that this is not a time to relax, that we can't expect, the Biden-Harris administration to do what is actually necessary. And I've particularly had a lot of focus in looking at his healthcare and COVID-19 plan. So I'm happy to talk about those in particular. But yeah, I think that we have a lot of work to do to get the things that we need in this country.
Well, that actually, you obviously, I'm going to ask you that question in a few minutes, is to jump into the healthcare plan and see your analysis. But Andy Ellis, what's your take?
I think in the Democrats' best case scenario, when they win both of those seats in Georgia in January, if that happens, Joe Manchin basically becomes the most important person in the United States Senate and becomes the person who is likely to be the deal maker and the person for whom negotiation can occur. And I think Joe Biden is loving a Senate where he has to explain that where he gets to tell all the progressives that he has to convince Joe Manchin in order to be able to hold the deal. I don't think that what we're looking at, people have said that he's the most progressive person since FDR, or at least that's the talking
Biden?
Yeah, that's the talking point, is that he's the most progressive platform since FDR, but I think he's going to govern more like Eisenhower, where he's racing to the center in order to make sure that the industrial complex, rushing to the center in order to make sure that progressives have no stance in this. I think we're in for a very dark time, and I think that the notion of being able to push him to the left has always been a lost cause, and we can see that by his cabinet picks.
So I was going to jump into healthcare, which I'll do in just a minute, because I really want to hear, especially Margaret, your take on where all this is. But let me pick up on this last point you just made, Andy. I mean, I think to really explore the political situation that America faces, I mean, and you may not agree with my entire analysis, and that's fine, and we can talk about it. But we saw the last 4 years when this almost neo-fascistic right-wing end of the ruling class and people on the right, really racist mobs on the right, kind of taking over, had the possibility of really taking over the country completely. And so that's one of the reasons you saw Greens and other third parties not really making it in this election, and the people being terrified of Trump and what the forces around him meant to get him out of the way. So now you have Biden, and Biden was elected with the black vote, with many communities of color votes, especially in the Mexican American community and other communities, and also though with Republicans who said no, and with suburban white women who were more moderate and centrist, who said no, and some of them even voted for Trump the last time. So you do have this power struggle going on inside, and clearly his appointments right now so far, while they've been multiracial, are also very centrist, leaning to the right and left, depending on which appointment you look at. So tell me what you will think, and I'll start with you, and then Margaret jump in, about where you think that takes the struggle, both internally inside the Democrats and maybe and Republicans as well, and the struggle outside. Where do you think it goes, Andy?
So, I want to go back to the Senate here, and I think that there's going to be such a razor-thin margin in the Senate that the party discipline within the Democratic Party is really going to not let people really step outside what the leadership means. Assuming that they win both of those seats, assuming that they get their best case scenario, the control of the Senate and of the House is going to be so strict that folks like the Squad, who may be able to take progressive stances on things like healthcare, but certainly won't be able to take progressive stances on things like Venezuela or militarism or imperialism. And
let me stop you 1 second. Just a quick question. So, and Mark, you can jump on this too, because this is also your bailiwick. But well, what do you mean they won't be able to take stances? What would stop AOC or any of the others who are in that progressive caucus, which is now larger?
We've been here before, right? I mean, this is exactly where we were in 2009 when Obama took office, and he had majority Democrats in the House and the Senate. And what I was hearing as someone who was down there frequently talking to the members was, oh, we can't go against Obama. He's our new president, and we have to support what he's pushing because the Republicans, those evil Republicans, are going to try to stop us. And so what do? They push through a healthcare bill that is a yearly multi-$100 billion bailout to the health insurance industry and making pharma, hugely rich. And they said, well, they passed it with all Democratic Party votes, not a single Republican vote, and still they passed a very flawed and problematic healthcare. And so this is what we're going to see and actually there are studies that look at this. There was one study that looked at the Senate and how policies changed, whether there was a Democratic or Republican majority. And it actually found that when the Democrats had the Senate, they were more conservative. And I think it's because when the Republicans are in power, the Democrats have to at least sound like they're fighting for something or trying to fight for something to get their base to vote for them back into power. But when they have power, then they're really good at making all these excuses for why they can't do the basic things that we need. And just look at how Obama treated labor. He wouldn't even give them card check. He promised that. I don't know if I can say this on the air. He screwed them in the healthcare bill. So, I think that Biden is to the right of where Obama was.
And I don't disagree with a lot of what you said, but I was actually pinpointing a lot of what Andy just said, though. The progressive movement, the numbers of people in Congress who are progressive and to the left are much greater numbers and much more out front about the battles and what they're struggling around than anybody was in 2008. So, while you can be right that nothing may happen in Congress, Andy, what I was trying to push in this thing in a minute was also, what makes you think that all the new representatives who just got elected, people who kept their seats, who are all on the progressive left within the Democratic Party, are not going to stand up and fight?
So I think they will fight on some domestic issues, and I think they will take positions on domestic issues that appear as if there's a fight, and party discipline will allow them to do that. I think what we will see on foreign policy issues and on imperialism issues is that they will toe the party line because they're afraid that if they start talking about defunding the military, or if they start talking about actual democratic elections in Venezuela, the things that they would need to do in order to fund the Green New Deal, they're going to find themselves without the ability. They're going to find themselves disciplined out of the ability to do that by the party because of the risk that will be told. The story will be that the risk in 2 years will be too high, and that the narrow margin that they have in the House will go away, and that those red swing those swing districts will be the ones that are at risk. So,
that's interesting. Go ahead. Finish
I
what
wanted
you're saying.
to jump in.
I'm sorry, Andy. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I figured you would.
Well, I think we're going to hear a lot of rhetoric, but still, in terms of the Democratic Party, if you look at the Democratic Party platform, it's not a progressive platform. People have tried to push it to be a progressive platform, and they've rejected that, every time. And the party is very good at controlling members of Congress. So yeah, they're free to go out there and say a lot of things, but we know how that political system works, and we know that, the vote trading that goes on. If there's a policy that the leadership wants, they will make sure it passes. And if they know they have enough votes to pass it, they'll give some votes to some of those progressive people to go ahead and oppose it or vote for, whatever it is that makes them look better. That's how the system works. But ultimately, if they want to get anything done, they know they have to be disciplined if they want to get, positions on committees or be able to bring things, before the committees or to the floor. They have to cooperate. So I think overall, the progressives that have been elected are still such a minority. And mostly what we're seeing in the Democratic Party is a shift to the military intelligence state, a security state Democratic Party.
I mean, I think all that's possible. I do think, though, and we will see how this pans out over the next several months, that there's nothing that I've seen so far that would lead me to believe that the most progressive voices so far that are in Congress will not continue that fight, whether it's foreign policy or domestic policy. I mean, we have a place now.
What fight have they waged? Look at how AOC backed down on the Green New Deal. What they put forth is nothing. And that committee that they had, the supposed committee, that was nothing too. So I'm not sure that I've actually seen them do anything substantial in their fight. I've just seen them back off.
Well, we can see how that unfolds. We do have this moderate president, and we are facing this huge economic crisis. 12 million Americans could lose their employment by year's end. We have food lines that are just absurd. Evictions are about to loom and explode across country. The pandemic. So, I mean, there's a lot could happen in all that in this Congress. I'm just curious. Let's talk a bit about what you think might happen. Let's talk about healthcare for a moment. I mean, that clearly Biden has said once or twice he will put a public option on the table as part of a deal. We'll see whether he does that or not. And expanding Medicaid, we'll see if he does that or not. So let's talk about that battle that's going to take place around healthcare and where you think that's going.
So
Margaret.
The Affordable Care Act, we have to recognize, as I said, was something that was created to bail out the insurance industry and protect the profits of the pharmaceutical industry. We had almost 50 million people who were uninsured in 2009, and something had to be done. It was a crisis. And the premiums were getting so high that people couldn't afford them. So what was the premise of that bill? It was to force people to purchase insurance and then use hundreds of billions of public dollars to help pay for that insurance. And actually, the government is even selling the insurance for the insurance companies. But what do people get with that? There's no guarantee that they can get the health care they need. The out-of-pocket costs are so high, and the restrictions are so strong, that people still can't get the care that they need. And so, what is Biden talking about? It's the same thing that's been talked about ever since the Affordable Care Act was passed. It was, he's talking about competition. How can we increase competition between the insurance companies? That was their whole premise, is that if you forced everybody to buy it, and then there'd be all these insurance companies, vying for people, and they would bring their prices down because they're competing. That didn't happen at all. Instead, the insurance companies have been raising their premiums by, double digits. And, and what they mean by competition, that we have a situation where in a lot of places, people don't really have a lot of choice. They have maybe 1, 2, or 3 insurances that they can pick from. And so what the Democrats have been talking about, and Biden too, is, well, if we give more money to the insurance companies, if we give them tax breaks to enter new markets, or we give them more reinsurance if they actually have to pay for healthcare, it's all about throwing more money into the pockets of the health insurance corporations. And right now we're in a situation where they are actually taking over our public insurances as well. More than half of the revenue of the major insurance companies comes from them being administrators for Medicaid or selling private Medicare plans. And they're working to increase that. So Joe Biden's public option idea, which, as public options don't work. They're a ruse. They're used to fool people into thinking that this is like some backdoor to single payer. And it's not. It's really throwing a public insurance out there allows the insurance companies to shift those patients that actually need health care into the public plan, just as they do with the Medicare Advantage plans. Basically, in Medicare, the private insurers insure the healthy seniors, and when seniors get sick and they realize their Medicare Advantage doesn't work, they go back into traditional Medicare. So traditional Medicare is struggling to care for the sickest population with the least amount of money, and the private plans are just making a whole lot of money off of it. So this is the type of situation that we're in, and it's why you can't tweak the system that we have right now. All it's going to be doing is throwing more money at the private insurers, and there's still going to be all the other problems that are driving people to go without care and health professionals to leave the practice. Doing a Medicare for all is actually the fundamental step, and he's not even willing to talk about that.
Now, I just before we jump into this last part here, I mean, I even have problems with calling it Medicare for all, because as someone who's at the age who gets Medicare is a great Yiddish expression. It's called bupkis, which means nothing, zip. And so if you just had Medicare and nothing else, you couldn't survive. You couldn't get your health care done. I mean, it's not really, Medicare is, it's just, you have, if you don't buy private insurance, which is what you were talking about, Medicare doesn't work. It doesn't work on its own.
There's traditional Medicare, and then people buy a supplemental plan to pay for the copays, not the copays, but the deductibles that they have to pay. But still, traditional Medicare works much better than private health insurance. It's just that it's been gutted. It's been gutted over the decades. And that's why we talk about improved Medicare for all. When we're talking about Medicare for all, we're not just saying give Medicare to everyone. We're saying get rid of the copays, make it comprehensive so that people don't have to have any supplemental insurance, that Medicare covers everything that's medically necessary, and you don't have to pay at the time of service. That's what we're talking about.
That's one reason I said that, just to put that up on the table so you would say that. So let me ask you both this question, though, and this is a political question around where this might go. So neither one of you are on the left wing of the Democratic Party. You are Green Party activists. Both of you have been Green Party activists and are. So let's talk about where you think that struggle goes after this, because Andy, you and I have written back and forth on Facebook in discussions about this a number of times together. And one of the things I think that Greens and the people on the left lack in the effort to build a larger movement is a real organizing effort, is really grassroots, in the streets, in the communities, in the union halls, in the churches, in the mosques, in the synagogues, organizing. And how do you expect the ideas that you have to really grab hold of a movement without organizing and not just playing from election to election and not just having demonstrations?
Yeah, sure. So, I think if you look at the race in Baldwin Park, California, where Emmanuel Estrada won his second attempt to become the mayor there, 26-year-old young man, I believe, who ran previously as a Green and didn't do very well, but spent the next 4 years organizing so that he could take that seat. I think you see the pathway to understand what it looks like. So what we're thinking about in Baltimore coming out of our most successful election yet is first, having a basic human rights and economic rights agenda to which we hold the city council and the elected people accountable. And we've knocked enough doors that we know what people want. We know that people want affordable housing. We know that they want a fair tax system. We know that they want safe communities that don't rely on police for public safety. And we know that they want schools that work for their children. We think that those are reasonable things. And we think that the new city government should be accountable to that. And then what we plan on doing is spending some time mobilizing the existing Greens in the city of Baltimore. Oftentimes the Green Party, like the Democratic Party, only has a few of its active members engaged in the day-to-day work. But we're going to spend some time based on the lessons that we learned from Estrada and Baldwin Park and we learned from Cam Gordon in Minneapolis, mobilizing our existing Greens first, and then having them organize where they know things are working in their community. I think that ultimately what we in cities like Baltimore is a municipal multi-party democracy. And I think once people see that working in a place like this, in order to hold folks accountable to delivering basic human rights and dismantling the systems of apartheid, which have denied those human rights, then I think that we begin to see possibilities of the future for what a multi-party federal democracy looks like. I think we're stuck right now. I think that we are stuck in a two-party system where Joe Manchin is the only person who will be a vote in the United States Senate that will ever be, for the most part, will ever be unpredictable. And I think that system is broken. I think that system means that there's no compromise. There's only compromise to the right. Imagine a system where council folks like Ryan Dorsey and Christopher Burnett here in Baltimore got to compromise to the left or compromise to the right. And I think that comes about by organizing. You're right. We have just tried to mobilize using the same tactics that Democrats and Republicans have, but we can't mobilize in order to get around the problem of a two-party system or a one-party system. We have to organize as well. And I think that we can look at examples that have worked around the country. I think we can employ those here. And I think that at the end of the day, though, we have to make it centered around basic pleas for government to deliver on human and economic rights that everybody understands are necessary.
Yeah, well, I think it's, and I want to go back to a point that you made earlier, because it's true. I mean, right now we're living in a failed system. The government can't do the basic things. It couldn't even protect U.S. lives from this pandemic, something that many other countries around the world have been able to do, and even countries much poorer than we have been able to do. And so you talked about, people were worried about Trump because of fascism, but I think that you have to have an understanding of how fascism works, and that fascism is a system that serves capitalism. And we have two capitalist parties, and basically the way that they operate is the kind of the democratic side is one that is able to put forward its policies with consent, right? They say, we're going to give you health care. They say, we believe that climate change is a problem, but then they don't use policies that actually live up to their language. But people go along with it because they think, oh, the Affordable Care Act, that sounds so good, I must be getting affordable care. So as long as that works, to serve the capitalist interest and the interest of the wealthy, then everything's fine. But when it doesn't work, that's when they bring in the more severe repression types of tactics. And we've seen those even under the Obama administration. I mean, I was one of the major organizers of the Occupy movement, and we had some, pretty brutal police repression during that time against those movements. So I think that people need to understand that until we actually get at the roots of the problem, we're not going to be able to solve the crises that we're facing. And so that's changing to a new economy. And that's something that the Green Party advocates for. The eco-socialist Green New Deal, which is the star of the Green Party platform, really puts forth an alternative economic system where people's needs are met, as Andy said, a human rights approach, and it's actually democratic. So people have a say over what's happening in their communities, over the policies that impact them. And that's what we need to be fighting for. And the role of third parties, whether they win or not, is to put these things on the agenda and to win support for them. And then those who stay in power, they may have to actually move in that direction to be able to stay in power. I mean, that's how third parties have changed policy throughout history in the United States.
So let's conclude with one thing I was thinking about as you were speaking, that you've seen Biden do things like take Bernie's plan to make public colleges, universities free, or at least to a certain extent. And his question of kind of supporting quote unquote Green New Deal, he doesn't, but it's on his website that he does, making investments in infrastructure, clean electricity, schools, and so I mean, so where do you think, when that is the public perception, where do you think you take that struggle next? What do you think happens in the next year under Biden-Harris?
Language is great, but what we need to see is actual policy. And I think that it's going to be imperative under this Biden-Harris presidency that that we continue as a party that represents the interests of the people to organize and mobilize people towards building real political power. And at the same time, I think people have got to keep their eyes open and not have any illusions that this administration is going to take their interests at heart. And I think any policy that gets put forward, people need to understand what it actually means, what it will actually do, because all of these things, you can say free college, but the way that it's structured, it may be that, you cover the tuition, but if you don't cover the other costs of college, that still means that people who don't have money can't go to college. So, so it's great for, people that do have money and they can afford the books and they can afford the dormitory and all that other kind of stuff. So I think it's really critical to look at what it is that's being put forward, and also to continue to raise our demands and not compromise. We know what we need. You talked about the minimum wage. That $15 an hour was not adequate back when it was first put. It needs to be in the 20s, right? With the way that that jobs are changing, we may need actually a guaranteed income to make sure that people are out of poverty. With the climate crisis and this pandemic, which is going to lead us into a prolonged recession or depression, we need $1 trillion of investment, or trillions of dollars of investment into a Green New Deal, into building, that infrastructure, clean energy, transportation, all of those, agriculture, all the things that we need to address the climate crisis. And that's what's going to lift us out of here. So we need to be keeping our eyes open, organizing for the alternative, and holding those standards of what we actually require as human beings.
I think at the end of the day, we have to return to a basic human and economic rights framework, and we have to make sure that that is available. That the COVID crisis that is coming, that is going to restructure our economy in ways that absolutely transform the world that we're used to. And we're going to see a lot more gig economy folks coming. One of the things that came out of the election that we just ran here in Baltimore City with Frankie Mueller-Paz was an interesting alignment of leftist groups, labor, and environmental groups. And it's something that we really haven't seen outside of the Democratic Party in Baltimore City. And if we can keep building on that here and in other cities where the crisis is going to be most acute across the country, I think we can offer people an alternative vision of what it looks like at the local level that will eventually help us to see what it looks like at the federal level. I think that a city like Baltimore is going to be in a very bad place as this crisis continues. People are going to die. People are going to lose jobs. People are going to get evicted. And those jobs aren't going to be coming back. And we're not going to be needing to organize on the ground with a new coalition in order to make sure that the government is actually living up to the needs of the people. And I think that the Green Party is well poised to do that here in Baltimore and in other places based on the experience that we just had in this last 2020 election.
Well, let me conclude with this. First, I thank you both for being here. And Andy Ellis, congratulations on the way you and all of you managed that campaign in Baltimore. It was the most successful Green campaign in the history of the city, and you all worked really hard on that and built that coalition. And Margaret, congratulations for being off of federal probation and going to Venezuela, that's also great. And we're looking forward to hear what happens when you get back and talk with you when you get back from that as well. So I want to thank you both so much for taking the time here today on The Real News. It's a pleasure to have you both.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
And I want to thank Erica Blount, the producer for this program, and Seppa Patuskin, who puts together all the graphics and editing. And thank you all for watching me. Part of this, please write to us here. You can write to us, Marc, M-A-R-C, at therealnews.com, and let me know what you think and what you'd like to hear, what your critique is. We're always open for all of that. So I'm Marc Steiner here on The Marc Steiner Show for the Real News Network. Thank you all so much for joining us, and take care.